Investors, and welcome to yet another edition of 18 Minutes with 180 Markets. Friends, we always preach being in the right sector, and one of the hottest sectors out there right now is biotechnology and medicine. And on top of it, you also need to be in a company-specific company that has near-term and longer-term catalysts where they can really control its own destiny. And I can't think of a market that is more true than right now because, friends, it has gotten harder out there. You do have to do more research. But that's why I'm so excited today to talk to Brian Leedman from OncoSil, because Brian is the right person with multiple success stories of creating shareholder value in a company that he co-founded, OncoSil, specializing in pancreatic cancer, which is certainly a market that we really want to solve for, if nothing else, just because it is such a deadly disease. But it also is a great opportunity for us as investors to actually line our own pockets as well. Brian, with that introduction, welcome to 18 Minutes with 180 Markets.
Greg, thank you for having me.
Hey, Brian, we always start out with people, and that is one of the attractions of you because, as I mentioned, you're a serial entrepreneur who has created a lot of success. It's not just ResApp, which I think a lot of our investors will always be familiar with, but can you just give people a little bit about your background?
Well, thank you, Greg. So I don't actually have a science background. I have more of an economics marketing background, and I've had a successful career at Westpac and also at Ernst & Young. But I did move into the biotechnology space some 15 or 17 years ago with a company called Cyvita Corporation, which was founded out of Western Australia, but it was also listed on the NASDAQ as well as the ASX and Frankfurt Exchange. So I did find myself over that 10-year period traveling the world, doing investor relations promotions for Cyvita, and I really cut my teeth going to conferences, meeting with fund managers, hedge fund managers, and just shareholders alike, and presenting for Cyvita. And then I decided that I would actually start up my own companies. And the first one I actually co-founded was OncoSil Medical. And I'm very proud to be sitting on the board of it today.
Got it. Hey, Brian, you recently joined the board and have a more active role in the company. And I'd like to get more specific on what you alluded to earlier about investor relations, because I always look for people to have a hard skill set. Can you just talk about that hard skill set that you're going to bring? Because you mentioned you're not the scientist per se.
No, I'm definitely not a scientist, but I think that's actually to my advantage because the investors that I typically talk to, they're not scientists either. And I think
for sure.
You can explain a company in a lot of different ways, and quite often you find that the companies are run by the scientists who created the technology themselves. And I think that's actually a big mistake because they can't speak layman's language in terms of what the technology does. They just find it difficult. I've experienced it many times with different scientists. And in my case, I definitely like to dumb it down to what is it that the product does. And going back to a simple marketing principle that I learned at university, which is sell the sizzle, not the sausage. And in the case of biotech, you can certainly explain OncoSil in a very complicated way. I don't do that because I can explain it in a way that makes sense to me. And if it makes sense to me, I'm sure it'll make sense to the prospective investors as well. So that's what I typically focus on.
Yes, absolutely. And, and turning to OncoSil itself, the company has been, frankly, a little bit sleepy over the past number of years as far as that investor relations role. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you'd like to see and bring to the table over the next 12 months?
Sure. Well, I mean, for starters, OncoSil was actually spun out of that company, Cyvita, that I mentioned earlier. It was actually formerly called Brachysil. And the technology is the same. The only difference is that OncoSil is now its own standalone company. And I think it floated about 8 years ago as a backdoor listing. But at the time, it was still in clinical studies. And it was only in a phase 2 clinical trial. Now, in fact, it's actually achieved regulatory approval with the CE mark in Europe, which is a huge achievement for any biotechnology company to actually get regulatory approval. So the big difference is that this company is now regulatory approved. Commercial sales have just recently commenced, and it's very promotable. The problem is that they haven't had anyone in the company for some years now actually doing promotion of OncoSil and its achievements to date and where it's going to head going forward. So I feel that my transition now onto the board for the first time, people out there think maybe that I've been on the board previously and then I left. That's not true. I was actually just part of the vend that created OncoSil. This is my first time actually on the board, and I'm very focused on telling this story. And you've seen me out there at conferences where we met last week in Sydney or in Melbourne, I mean, at the Techno Invest conference. And I'm out there taking advantage of every opportunity to promote this story.
Got it. And speaking of the story, pancreatic cancer, can you just start out talking about a little bit about the size of the market and, and also for people that don't know, unfortunately, it is a very deadly disease, and also how OncoSil solves that problem?
Sure. So, if you think about all the cancers that one could possibly be inflicted with, pancreatic cancer is by far the worst. It has the lowest long-term survival. It is usually diagnosed extremely late. And typically what happens in layman's terms is that someone might present with lower back pain. If they're of a particular age, the doctor is immediately thinking about pancreatic cancer. And unfortunately, if the tumor is too big and then it's actually pressing on the lower nerves and the spine, it's actually already too big to surgically operate, or what they call resection. And the best way to treat any cancer is to cut it out. That's what we call resectable cancer. Unfortunately, for pancreatic cancer, only 15% of patients at the point of diagnosis are actually eligible for resection. That means 85% of people at the time of their diagnosis are actually diagnosed with non-resectable pancreatic cancer. And that is a very short-term outlook for those patients. And there's not a very good option of treatments available to them. It's always to do with chemotherapy. Obviously, that makes you fairly sick, and even the long-term survival is very low in that case. There is, however, 30% of patients who fall into the category of non-resectable, but also localized. So that means that pancreatic cancer is still contained within the pancreas. It hasn't become metastasized, starting to spread throughout your body. At that time, the only option for you was chemotherapy. But OncoSil fits into that 30% category where it's still localized, but it's not spread. And the idea is, by placing this radioactive particle directly into the tumor, as we do, you can actually shrink the tumor and make you eligible for resection. And that means that you've got the surgical intent to cure you of this disease.
Right. Now, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you're effectively reducing the tumor to make it so it can be operated on.
Exactly. You can't cut out your pancreas. You can't live without your pancreas. So if the tumors are too big, then you can't cut out the pancreas. But if they're small enough, you can cut that section out.
Right. And for OncoSil itself, you're at the stage now where, can you just talk about Germany and where you are? Because you are in operation. This is not something that's 10 years away, so to speak, because unfortunately it does take 10 years and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars today to bring something to market. But you're on the cusp.
Well, we're already now regulatory approved, and the operations, so the CEO of the company, Nigel Lang, who, by the way, is the former CEO of Certex Medical, which has a comparable type of technology, but for liver cancer, they were acquired by a major Chinese pharmaceutical company for $1.5 billion. So there is potentially a large exit for these type of oncology companies. The OncoSil technology, I think, is quite superior to what the Certex product is, but I'll explain that shortly. But in any case, Nigel is based in Germany, in Berlin, and that is the center of the largest commercial market in Europe for medical products such as these. So that's where we're focusing our attention. And we do have, as you mentioned, that German hospital study, where 25 German hospitals have been fully funded to actually execute on providing surgeries for eligible pancreatic cancer or localized pancreatic cancer patients. And that's only a recent development. And so we will see patients being enrolled in that study. It's not a study, it's actually a commercialization where they're fully funded to receive that product. And that will generate significant revenues to OncoSil.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And speaking of that, can you just take us through maybe like the next 12 to 24 months there? Like, what would ideally you like to see?
Well, so we have had some significant announcements this year. In particular, we've had our first patients actually treated in Spain. So there are a number of patients that are undergoing the resection treatment, the actual OncoSil treatment with the intent to provide surgical treatment for those patients to actually cut out those tumors. So that's happening in Spain right now. Germany is gearing up for the commencement of that of those patients being treated with their fully funded study or trial that they're undergoing there. And there's also another trial that has also been approved, which is for public health reimbursement in Germany. That will be a major thing. So right now, even though it's regulatory approved, it's not subsidized. And the treatment is rather expensive because it obviously involves a radioactive particle. There's a quite significant expense associated with manufacturing OncoSil. So having public health reimbursement in Germany will be a major catalyst. And I might add that just recently we had UK private company or private health cover reimbursement approved. So that's a big opportunity there. So I see more reimbursements being approved for OncoSil in Europe in different jurisdictions, and then actually turning into surgeries that will generate revenues for OncoSil.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, can you just also, and again, I'm glad because you mentioned earlier that about the non-science part of running a business, that unfortunately there's so many devices, drugs out there that if they can't get reimbursed, frankly, they just don't make any kind of economic sense, and hospitals just never use it. I'm sure you're very aware of that. So can you just touch again on how important it is to have this healthcare reimbursement, number one, and number two, maybe also just tell investors a little bit more about how you or Nigel gets involved in that side of the non-science part of the business?
Well, certainly public health cover reimbursement is critical, particularly for an expensive treatment. I mean, we all read about in Australia how a drug gets added to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, and it changes the cost factor for patients from something outrageous to something that's really cheap. The reality is that the company that developed that drug and being subsidized by the federal government is still getting the full amount. It's just that the taxpayer is now paying them rather than out of your pocket. And so that's obviously a big deal for any company such as OncoSil. So getting onto that scheme is definitely going to open up the sales for OncoSil to a much wider audience that can then afford to have the treatment. There are many surgeons who are now starting to recommend this treatment simply because it is the best course of action for their patients. And that's what doctors will always do, regardless of the cost. They're going to recommend the best course of treatment for them that's going to give them hopefully long-term survival, which is what the OncoSil product does in the patients that actually undergo the resection, or sorry, the actual treatment and have resection of their tumors. They have incredible long-term survival as a result of that. So doctors are going to continue to use the product, and as they do so, they're going to continue to recommend it. There'll be scientific publications about the treatment that's only going to propagate the use of OncoSil for pancreatic cancer. And Nigel, being based in Berlin, is ideally positioned to further the growth in that. And that's what he's entirely focused on doing.
Yeah, and is that why he's based over there right now?
Absolutely, yes. He's most definitely. He's actually, I caught up with Nigel in Brisbane and Sydney a few weeks ago. He actually speaks Deutsch. He's actually originally Canadian, but he speaks German too. So he's a very impressive guy. And of course, coming from a background being CEO at Certex, I mean, what a massive coup for OncoSil to be able to get him to come over from Certex to OncoSil. They're compatible companies in terms of the field of brachytherapy, which is the oncology treatment that we specialize in. And given the enormous success that Certex has had, I'd like to see that carry on to OncoSil for the benefit of our shareholders.
Yeah, definitely. And when you think about also, I think that Germany has circa 80, 90 million people or something of that nature. In Europe, forgive me, I don't know exactly the size of the population over there, but it's hundreds of millions. Is it also, frankly, just a much bigger target market that's just Australia by itself?
Well, of course, I do get, as I did get last week when I was over in Sydney and Melbourne for Techno, because there were so many potential investors, and some of them are investors in the audience, and saying, when can we get this treatment available in Australia? And the answer is, we actually did the clinical studies in Australia. So we can pursue TGA approval, but the Australian market is only about 25 million people. It's just not a very big market, and it does cost a lot of money to go through the regulatory process. So focusing on Germany or in Europe, and particularly Germany in the first place, is the most lucrative market for us to pursue at present. But of course, the most lucrative market is going to be FDA for the United States. And that is definitely a focus for us moving into next year. That would be a tremendous outcome for our shareholders of going down the regulatory pathway for FDA.
Yeah, no doubt, no question about that. But it's also nice to see it doesn't take a big leap to see how OncoSil could be in significant revenue within kind of 18 to 24 months, would you say?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about internally, is that we think we'll be able to generate significant revenues from the uptake of the treatment, particularly in Germany, but also now with private health cover reimbursement in the UK. That's going to lead to further adoption there. The reality is this product is superior in the way that it can target people who are localized advanced pancreatic cancer. So clearly they can't have resection right now, but the tumors haven't spread outside the pancreas yet. So there is the opportunity to shrink those tumors and be able to then undergo resection. And that's the goal. And for people who are suffering with pancreatic cancer, they don't have a lot of options, and there hasn't been much in the way of progress in the way that they treat pancreatic cancer in the last 10, 20 years. So this OncoSil, I think, is the most disruptive new technology that can give survivability for patients with localized advanced pancreatic cancer.
Absolutely. And Brian, as you well know, medicine today, it's actually a pretty small world where so many of the companies know each other. It's a question I can't resist asking, but you don't have to necessarily answer. Is also, I would assume that then you become on the radar screens of some of the very big pharmaceutical and drug companies out there in the world.
Oh, I mean, that is ultimately the goal. You know what? I was criticized early on when I founded ResApp Health. And I said to investors, I said to investors that, I want to raise money to float this company, but I want you to know that ResApp will never make a dime. And people would go, what? What are you talking about? Why would I invest in that? But I would always pause and say, because we will be acquired before we start generating money. Now, I knew that the technology was disruptive, and I knew that we were going to get on the radar of somebody. I thought it might be Apple, to be honest. I didn't realize it was going to end up being Pfizer, but I'm not complaining. But that's what happens. You get out there, you promote the story,
right,
on their radar, and they come along and they say, you know what, we're going to have this because we can really commercialize it. And there is a saying in biotech, and that is that you can only have a blockbuster product if big pharma's selling it. And
yes,
that's a long-held view, and it's absolutely true. In the case of OncoSil, if we had the power backing of a big pharma actually promoting and selling and recommending this product, then that would be the outcome. And that's certainly what happened to Certex. So that would be my ultimate goal. Are we talking to any big pharma right now? No, I can't say that we are. I can't certainly reveal any discussions that we might be having with any big pharma at the moment. But I do think that that is the ultimate outcome for this company.
Right. And then again, by you being on the circuit, by you then, let's just fast forward another 12, 18 months, by being in some revenue, maybe the company's a little bit further along. Naturally, in my experience with big pharma, they'd rather pay up for something that they know is heading in the right direction than maybe pay a little bit less at a very, very early stage.
Of course, because these big companies, they don't take risk. I mean, they've got more money than some countries, so they can certainly not afford not to take risk, but there has to be a novelty to what it is that you do. It has to be something special. I just want to point what the novelty is for OncoSil.
That would be great.
So what makes the product totally unique is that the OncoSil particle is actually got a half-life of 14 days, but it releases all its radiation within 81 days. So it's actually like a bit of a slow burn. And it goes in there and it goes into the pancreatic cancer and it actually kills the tumor from the inside out at a rate that the body can dispose of the dead tissue. So that is what makes it special. But there's also one very novel aspect, and that is that these particles are only 30 microns in size. That is really small. And so this type of brachytherapy treatment, as with all brachytherapy treatments, what happens is the particles are so small that once they place it into the body, they tend to just move around. And they float around and they kill everything in their path.
That's how they work.
That's how it works. So with OncoSil, however, the actual particle structure is such that it has this huge surface area. And this nanostructuring of this huge surface area means that it's actually sticky. And the stickiness means that when the doctor places the particle directly into the tumor, where he or she places it is actually exactly where it stays. And that becomes what you refer to as targeted. And that is a unique property of OncoSil. So it's a very targeted treatment. It's a very effective treatment. And you don't necessarily want those particles floating all over the place. You want them to stay where you put them, because obviously they will destroy everything in their path.
Right. So it's basically extremely targeted therapy, slow release, 81 days, as opposed to, even though it's in there for 14 days. And these
Well,
are,
the half-life is 14 days, but
excuse
it's
me.
pretty much burnt out over an 81 period.
Right. I call it slow release in my terms, but maybe that's not the right terminology. It doesn't matter as long as I can understand it.
Sure.
So, right. So that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Hey, Brian, again, it sounds like such an exciting story because you really have a unique product and you're at the right time on the cusp. In closing, if there were 1 or 2 points about the business that you'd love people to just, if nothing else, just know about OncoSil, what would they be?
Well, it's simply that this is obviously a very targeted treatment for pancreatic cancer. It appeals to a very large group of currently patients who have localized treatment or localized advanced cancer, but it is localized, and it gives them that option to be able to have an effective treatment. So it gives hope to people that otherwise have very poor outlooks. So that, for me, is really the primary reason why I think this company is so exciting, and one of the reasons why I got involved in the first place. And I might want to add that I used to promote Brachysil when under the banner of Cyvita many years ago. I love talking about this technology. I did it all over the world. That was one of the drivers why I saw the opportunity to spin it out and create this new code, now being OncoSil Medical. It's so exciting for me to be actually come back all these years later and be able to tell the same story, but the difference is that the technology is now regulatory approved. It's amazing. And all that clinical work has already been done in the past now. And yes, the share price has bounced around a bit, but now it's actually a point where we can actually go and commercialize and actually deliver the benefits for these patients who need this type of treatments. And I'm very proud that it's an Australian company. Science was developed here in Australia, tested in Australia, and now being commercialized in Europe. I think that's something to be very proud of.
Excellent. Brian, we will definitely stay tuned, and I'm sure we will be updated by you.
Yeah, terrific. And Greg, thank you for your time today.
Easy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of 18 Minutes with 180 Markets. And don't forget, if you want access to thousands of capital raises, sign up at 180markets.com.au and you'll get access to our very next capital raise. Thanks for watching.